Barkha Dutt is one of India's best-known broadcast journalists and authors. She's the founder and editor of Mojo Story, a digital platform, a columnist with the Washington Post and the Hindustan Times. You've been nominated for an Emmy. You've been recognized by the World Economic Forum, and you've been honored with the Padma Shri, India's fourth highest civilian honor. She's also the author of two books, To Hell and Back, Humans of COVID, and This Unquiet Land, Stories from India's Fault Lines. Thank you so much for being on Public Health on Call. And just before we started recording, I was like, there are so many things that we could talk about here because your career is just so expansive and you have done so much, but we were able to find a through line. So what we're going to do is talk about your work. You are a war correspondent, and you have also covered in depth gender equity issues and violence against women. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hit and you became a health correspondent. So tell us about that shift.
Thank you for having me. And that's such an interesting question. As someone who spent maybe 20 years reporting from conflict zones, war zones, COVID was like reporting a war, actually. In so many ways, it was as dangerous, and you could not actually pinpoint where the danger was coming from because there was so little that was known. And it went on, unlike war and conflict, which sometimes have a finite end in sight, for a really, really long time. I had never actually reported on health before, but when India announced a lockdown in the first wave, taking their cue from countries around the world, at first, most of us thought this was what was desirable and this was what was needed. What we did not know at that time was that sometimes a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't actually work in a health crisis. And basically what happened was that with the lockdown came the shutdown of public transport in the first wave, and which basically meant that no buses, no airplanes, no trains were running. Alongside this, while most people of my class were ready to hunker down and stay at home, India's poorest citizens, who basically worked as daily wage contract workers in the cities but had homes in the villages and therefore lived in temporary, shelters on construction sites or so on, they basically, as economic activity came to a standstill, not just lost their way of earning, like you and me, they wanted to be home. Here at Hopkins, everybody I've met, the first question I asked them is, when the lockdown came, what was the first thing you wanted to do? And invariably, no matter where you ask this question in the world, everybody says, I wanted to go home. And one thing I learned was that policy, in particular in public health policy, when public health policy does not anticipate human emotion, human psychology, somewhere it will hit a wall. So in India, what happened is we had hundreds of thousands of our poorest citizens deciding to walk home. And when I say walk home, I don't mean Baltimore to DC even. I mean 700, 800,000 kilometers in instances, sometimes barefoot, often without food, often without water, carrying their infants on their shoulders, along with their entire universe packed into a little bag because they didn't know when they'd be able to go back to the city. And my journey with reporting the pandemic began when I set out by road in a car, literally traveling. I covered 30,000 kilometers from the north to the south of India, and India is a really big country, spending 125 days in the first wave on the road. And it just taught me so much about journalism, about structural inequality, about how maybe as journalists everywhere in the world we seem to be reporting on content that is navel-gazing instead of speaking to the issues that concern people. And of course, it taught me from a distance a lot about public health and policy. And that's how I came to be kind of India's COVID correspondent over 2 years.
So there's a role here for journalists to be telling these stories, especially in somewhere like where you were, where, we don't necessarily have someone that's working in policy connected to how that policy is actually playing out on the ground. And so your role then becomes telling those stories so that people can actually see what are maybe the unintended consequences. Can you talk about one in particular? I mean, you mentioned transportation. What's another one that you saw, how policy wasn't necessarily connecting to what was best for people on the ground?
Yeah, and that's not because the policy wasn't well-intentioned. The policy was very well-intentioned, and that's important to say. So let's pick up another thing we grappled with in the pandemic was the physical closure of schools. In India, even when schools were ready to open, we had parents just refusing to send their children to school. And so, it's a little bit similar to the debate ongoing here in the US about work from work or work from home. So you had parents just saying, no, we're not comfortable. Through first wave, second wave, Omicron, they were just like, we're not sending our kids to school. Now, what happened when classrooms turned digital? And we're talking about a very progressive country digitally. There's 700 million Indians who are active online. But when you actually break this down into the idea of a digital classroom, all your existing inequalities get exacerbated. So, for instance, women and girls experienced the pandemic in a very different way from men and boys. When I traveled across rural India, I found that in some states where child marriage, which is a practice that India had started actually gain success in reversing and bringing the numbers down, child marriage actually rose up again during the pandemic, and girls suffered the most. And let me tell you what happened. Let's say there was a home where there was one phone or one device and dodgy internet connection. The families would privilege the boy getting access to the classroom over their daughter, because that idea that the boy has to grow up, become a man who will work, is still sort of an entrenched misogynistic cultural assumption. When the boy would get access to that classroom and the girl would not, the girl would be asked, what are you doing? You're not doing anything all day. Let's actually get you married. And in some cases, I met mothers who actually thought that girls were safer in an environment which was another village, rather than in a home where maybe 8 people were living in a small closet-side space. These were poor families where their partners, their husbands, were in some cases alcoholic, abusive, were consuming child pornography or pornography of other kinds at home. And they didn't. So strangely, this idea of child marriage, which is so abhorrent otherwise, became for mothers a way to protect their children. Now, the girls I met actually sort of resisted this idea. And they, when they were persistently asked, what do you do all day? They formed a football team. And they said, we're going to fight misogyny with football, by playing football. And I tracked them for a while, and some of them had happier endings. They had dreams of becoming police officers and government officials, and some of them were able to fend off getting married in their teenage years, and some of them could not resist and were married. And then it takes you back to, should a 15-year-old girl, a 9-year-old girl, a 10-year-old girl being pushed into a marriage, into her body being, she's not at that age of informed consent. So it goes back to reproductive health. It goes back to teen pregnancies. It goes back to mental health. And that is how you will see health link back in the most unexpected of ways. If I were to tell you lockdown, school closure, girls' health, you wouldn't immediately see the connection, but this is how the dots join.
Yes. And in your experience, you mentioned earlier that you started to see how inequities that kind of already existed, even in places where there had been progress made, really got set back during the pandemic. And this is not something that is unique to India. This is worldwide. So tell us a little bit about what you've seen from your reporting along that.
I'm glad you made the point about it being worldwide, because sometimes I think when we start having conversations about gender and women and girls, and we locate it in countries like mine, at least I know, because I went to both school here and grad school here, I know that there's so many stereotypes and so much ignorance about my country. And there's this idea that we live in some dinosaur age where, women are just so poorly off, and how we're such victims compared to women in the West. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm glad you flagged the fact that the debate around gender is a universal phenomena. Globally, women are exhausted because of how much we have to fight every day for basic rights, including just the right to decide what happens to our bodies, right? No place should that have more resonance than here in the United States, where what has happened with abortion, it just galls me as an Indian sitting 11,000 miles away. And our laws, by contrast, are very progressive. Our Supreme Court, by contrast, just actually increased the duration in which a woman can legally seek an abortion. But having made that point about the universality of some of these battles, the virus was described as the great equalizer. There was this sort of cliched assumption that the pandemic had finally flattened the world. Everybody was scarred. Everybody was impacted the same way. It's true that the virus left nobody untouched, but it's also true that wherever there was an inequality, that inequality was exacerbated and deepened and heightened by the pandemic. So I already said that women and girls experience the pandemic in a different way than men. Let me give you one more example. We had women drop out of the workforce. I don't know the data for the United States, but in India, millions of women unable to just deal with their partners being at home, their children being at home, and also having to run a job. And given that there is no equality in our home spaces of the kind that we would want, women were landed with the inordinate burden of managing home, work, children, partners, food, health, also looking after themselves. And female labor force participation in India which is how many women are in the workforce, took a knock, right? So that's another way in which the pandemic was experienced differently. The poor, I already mentioned the daily wage workers who walked home, they experienced the pandemic differently. So whether it was intersections of class, caste, gender, wherever there was an inequality, it was heightened by the pandemic. Domestic abuse, domestic violence cases spiked. Child sexual abuse, calls by children to the government-run helplines increased, right? So I think these were 2 years that changed all of us and the world as we knew it, but they changed the lives of some more than others.
And this is really a humanitarian crisis. It's not just about gender, race, class, ethnicity. Let's talk a little bit about, what are some of the things, because I don't want there to be this one story about India, and you raise that point. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other humanitarian crises that you've seen kind of come out of the pandemic globally.
Yeah, I think the death of the city, to me, especially in the West, India has responded in a somewhat different way. While there is still sections of the workforce that does not want to completely come back to work. And while there are people who now want a hybrid model more and more, and workspaces have become more flexible, I find cities are hollowing out. When I came to New York this time, my memory of New York is somebody who studied in PS 99 Kew Gardens, Queens, and then came back to Columbia for my graduation in journalism. My memory of New York was a gritty city, and now it seems like a grubby city, right? And part of the reason is the hollowing out of the centers of cities, because we haven't been able to reimagine the workspace in a way that there's agreement on. And this is a global phenomena. It's interestingly a phenomena that India is not going through. Our cities are bouncing back, right? But equally, I think there's a generational clash on how to see issues of mental health, mental well-being. For people of my generation, work defined us. If you took away my journalism, I would feel like I'm nothing. And so it just defines me so much that I'm unable to fathom that there are many people for whom work is a job and not the center passion of their lives. And I have a friend who says to me that when I say that work defines me, that I speak from a position of privilege, because I'm not necessarily working only to make ends meet. And there are so many people who are working to make ends meet. So, we have workspace conflicts, very strong ones, with different generations actually colliding on the idea of even how to approach a mental health conversation, right? What just seems, because I was trained that way as a tough day at work, today will be received as a triggering day at work for a younger colleague, right? And I think, we have not resolved these conversations in the post-pandemic age, and I don't think we're equipped with how to resolve them, because they fast sort of descend into a kind of, oh, you're such a boomer, or oh, you millennials, or oh, you Gen Zs, and there's no actual meeting ground on how people negotiate today their workspaces and their work lives. And I find that almost to be like the biggest gap of our contemporary times. Like, what does work mean to people today?
I want to pick up on that a little bit and kind of, although we're trying to avoid tropes about your work, I do want to, it's worth mentioning that you've received threats for the work that you do because of where you're reporting, because of what you're reporting. And so when you think about younger people facing so many different challenges than maybe what you had or I had, and you think about the important work of a journalist in telling these stories, what advice would you have? What comes to mind for me is the death of Mahsa Amini in Iran, and the two young journalists that were accused of, and I think charged with propaganda and accused of being CIA spies. They were on the ground telling this very important story, risking their lives. And so what advice would you have for young women in particular who want to do what you are doing, and knowing that the pandemic has set us back in so many ways, and knowing that traditional work and finding a career is in many ways a privilege? What advice would you have for them?
It's an interesting question. And I would say that, I've often been asked about fear and why I don't feel it. And I always say that it's not true that I don't feel fear, whether it was, reporting from the front lines of a war between India and Pakistan in 1999, or 2 years of the pandemic, when literally we knew so little that some days moments I would get this thought that I'm going to die from this thing, and eventually I lost my father to COVID. And the way I processed that was by just immersing myself deeper and deeper in work. And I always say that I don't think anybody is without fear and vulnerability. I think what happens is that you find something that feels larger than yourself. And for that moment in time, it displaces the fear. Because you have this acute sense of being in a moment that is larger than an individual. And if I had to actually say what journalism is and what the importance of journalism is, it is precisely that you find that you are telling the story of something that is larger than yourself and feels worth, maybe not consciously, but it is subliminally taking the risk to tell that story, because the magnitude or the consequences of what you're trying to report are that large. Right. And therefore you are temporarily able to, I call it postponing fear, or postponing grief, which is what I did when my father died, because I had to function. Of course, it's not the best way to be. I should caveat that not everybody processes things in the way that I do. I advise people to seek professional counseling if they should so need, without embarrassment. And everybody copes differently. It's a difficult time to be a journalist globally. It's a difficult time to be a journalist globally because technology is pulling the rug from under our feet. You have OpenAI today posing questions about redundancy. You have polarized societies like never before. There is a pressure there's a kind of tribalism almost, be in this side or that side of one or the other ideology or party. Revenue models are broken. Anyone with a phone today and a TikTok or an Instagram account fancies themselves to be a journalist. And in some ways, the democratization of the content space is healthy. But in other ways, you are dealing with a pandemic of fake news, a pandemic of misinformation, of extreme toxicity, and violent threats online. It is not unusual for women online in every part of the world to receive extremely sexualized threats of rape, comments on your body, your weight, the color of your skin. And while I have learned over the years to grow a thick skin, I have seen younger female colleagues leaving social media platforms feeling the equivalent of being lynched. It's like virtual lynching when the trolls come after you, right? My advice would still simply be that do it if you love it. This is not a gig profession. There are some that are that, but journalism is hard. Journalism is hard for multiple reasons, and there will be constant public scrutiny. And therefore, come into it only if you love it, or you think you might love it. B, it may look like you're becoming redundant, but never before has truth-telling and storytelling been as compelling a need for us as people as it is today. And I think the pandemic in so many ways brought that home. And C, I think for girls and women everywhere, let us not be defensive about our gender. When I was younger, I wanted to be evaluated on my work alone. I didn't want the prefix of being a woman journalist. But I have to say that I have to work, even today, 5 times harder than my male colleagues, and I will be scrutinized 10 times more than my male colleagues. So I have learned to not disown the sort of gendered experience, and there is entrenched discrimination for women. Women are more tired than men because we're fighting and negotiating every single day, every single moment. And sometimes we're fighting ourselves because there's this part of us that can see that something we're doing is coming from cultural conditioning and we don't really like that bit about ourselves, but you can't help. Like, you don't want to put that filter on your Instagram selfie, but you will because you don't like the image that's staring back at you, and your mind is telling you that's just massification, that's just cultural conditioning. You're like, okay, but it's okay, you can allow yourself a break, right? So we're constantly in a debate mode with others, with institutions, with ourselves, and we're tired. And we need to own our gender. We need to own the fact that it's harder for us. And this is not just in journalism. This is in every profession. And I think we need to stop being defensive about the fact that it's harder for us.
It's not a zero-sum game.
No, it is never a zero-sum game.
Let me ask you this. We just have a couple of minutes left.
Sure.
What's the story you want to tell next?
That's such an interesting question. I don't know. I think the story I want to tell next is a question. And the question is, at a time when no matter which part of the world you're in, people are not ready to have a conversation across the aisle. There is no dialogue left in our conversation. There's no civility left in our debates. I would want to explore if, as a journalist, I can create a language, a mechanism, a vehicle that allows conversations to take place between people who otherwise would refuse to talk to each other. I find that the tragedy of our times is that instead of contesting ideas, which we must, we are just shouting at each other. And I grew up, in a small refugee colony in Delhi because my family came from what is now Pakistan, and they lost everything when India was partitioned. And we went from, our family went from extreme wealth to being a penniless family, and we grew up in this refugee colony that had all sorts of migrant populations, and we often disagreed ideologically, but we always ended the evening, and I'll say it in Hindi, where someone, and the elder neighbor would say, "Oh, acha, bahut ho gaya, ab samosa kha ke jao. Okay, now enough arguing, eat a samosa before you go," right? And my point is, when did we lose the spirit of genuine debate, genuine argument? And I feel like I want my journalism to be something that all sides can access and maybe create a space for agreement in an extremely divided world.
I think we can all come together around a samosa.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for being on Public Health on Call. This has been such an
me.
expansive, wide-ranging conversation, and maybe we'll have you back to have one of those kind of across-the-aisle conversations.
Look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.